So Dolores, DLRS, what really is it, right? We have some people on the call who've used it a lot. We have some people who don't even know what it is. Some people have heard about it. Ultimately, it's basically we're going beyond standard rollup summaries. So this lets you, every time you're like, man, I wish I could do a rollup summary for that. Well, you can probably do it with DLRS if you can't do it with standard rollup summaries. You can use it on lookups. You can even use it on a text field. You could do infinite levels. I like using rollups in the account hierarchy so I can see all the child income and then the current account income and then the grandparent all the way up through the entire hierarchy and just keep infinitely rolling those things up. You can also do different things like concat or count distinct or first last if you sort your SOQL query. So you can get a lot more information types into that field than you can in a standard rollup summary. You can also do this in real time or asynchronous. You can have a lot more control over how it works. You can run it from a flow, you can run it from code, you can let DLRS install its own code, or you can put it in your code, process builders. There's lots of different ways to run it. And we'll go through a couple of those options with triggers and flows and scheduling and how all that works and kind of when you should pick which option. Tons of people use DLRS. I was blown away by these statistics, but it's actually installed in 20,000 production orgs. 17,000 of those still active. So there's 17,000 production orgs that have DLRS in it and actively have it. And we've had over 2,900 new installations this year. So a lot of people use it. It's a really popular add-on for Salesforce. The open source commons team, there's tons of people on the team. We have over 15 active volunteers right now, which is really awesome. We joined the open source commons a year ago. So we've had a lot of momentum just by joining that and switching over. Andy Fawcett, who created it, is still advising, is still helping us with roadmap. But we have awesome people at Salesforce helping out, like Corey O'Brien, David Reed, Reed Stockton, others people are helping out, make sure we're on the right path, and even adding some features that help with NPSP compatibility with TDTM and things like that. We'll talk about in a little bit. So again, I kind of want to look at what's the difference between DLRS and rollup summaries. I'll show you some more examples here. But in a sense, DLRS it's harder, but it's more flexible, right? And so you have to get comfortable with what it's doing. And once you're comfortable with that, then you can really just do those things that you wish you could do with rollup summaries. So DLRS can use a lookup. They both can use master detail. DLRS doesn't have any limits on how many per object besides your standard object limit. So if your object limit's 500 fields, I mean, you could have 500 DLRS rollups. You'd want to, make sure you're doing that appropriately and you've got that optimized, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well, but there are no limits to it. And you can also use other report qualifiers in reports. So there's things like starts with or other things, because essentially we're taking the DLRS rollup value and we're just putting it in a standard field, right? We're putting in a standard text field, a standard number field, whatever type of standard field you want to put that value in. So it's anything else like reports treats it as a standard field that somebody typed in or some automation typed in. So that means we can also do things like cross-object formulas. We can roll those up. We can also have all sorts of entry criteria because DLRS is based on SOQL queries and SOQL where clauses. So you don't have those 5 simple kind of drop-down comparison filters. Whatever you can do in a SOQL filter, you can put in there. So that's just a little bit of high-level difference between the two. So what can DLRS do that rollups can't? So there's some stuff out there, like use a rollup summary field to count the number of activities for an account, like events, tasks. You can't do it with rollup summaries. You can do it with DLRS. What else can't you do with rollup summaries? You can't roll up a lot of standard objects, right? You can't roll up cases. You can't roll up other things around context or just things that in the standard UI doesn't let you do, but you can do it in DLRS. And so here's side-by-side comparison, right? On the left, that's like a standard rollup summary. If you pick a count and you want to summarize some objects, in this Scratch org, I only get these 3 objects. And then you can do your count, your sum, your min, max, and your 5 criteria. On the right is DLRS. It in the new wizard, you're going to see in a second, X shows you every single object that you are allowed to roll up that it found for you and says, hey, you can roll up any of these objects if you want. So you got cases in there, you got contacts, you got events, you got email message, you really got anything that you can imagine. Installation's pretty straightforward. It's like any other app. There is a thing called meta deploy that helps you with installing this. So here is the install Salesforce.org products. So you can see it here. So just like if you're using meta deploy for NPSP or anything else, it's here as well, and you can install that. Once you get installed, you just install it for admins only. You'll see that it's installed, and you're pretty much off to the races. There's not a ton of configuration that you have to do besides start creating your individual rollups. When you open DLRS, you're going to see a couple different tabs. There's one thing I like to call it as the optimizer. This is a newer feature, but it checks to make sure that DLRS is set up appropriately for you. And so if we come back over here, you can see that I'm in the app and I've got this tools page, and I can check the optimizer. It says, hey, everything looks good. Okay. Then you're going to go forward and we're going to look at the original wizard, which is you have to type it all in from memory. This wizard for creating a rollup has been here for years. And then we have a new wizard that just came out in August that's still kind of in beta, where you can click the button, you can try it out. And that's the one that's going to actually walk you through every field and input and let you select from pick lists versus having to type in all the API names yourself. So it's really helpful. And so you can look at this and you can say, okay, I'm going to manage my lookup rollup summaries, and I can see my existing rollup summaries. You can see I've put some demo ones in here for cases, on account, contacts, cases, total contacts here. And you can click and you can try the new wizard if you want, and then it'll walk you through everything here. So instead of having to type everything in, but then you can pick your parent object, you can pick account, confirm, and then it's going to think, and then you can pick a child account. So you might not be able to see this pop up, but I've got like 30, 40 plus things that I can pick from. I can pick case and confirm, and then it's automatically going to put the relationship lookup field in there or master detail field in there for you. And then down here now for the field to aggregate, you're going to kind of notice that it's also a pick list, and you can pick whatever you want. Now, if we're just doing a count, it's always best to use the ID, because the ID is always going to be filled in for a count. And then we can set this to count. And then we say, hey, we're going to count cases, and we're going to roll that up, right? And then which cases do we want to count, right? So that's where the relationship criteria and the relationship criteria fields are. This is using SOQL query statements, so like a where clause. So we would say where status equals escalated or something. So we could do status equals escalated. And we could do that in single quotes for how SOQL queries work. And you can learn more about that and look at that in the dev console. I like to practice in the dev console and make sure that it works before I put it in here. Then you can do some other things about the calculation mode and sharing mode. And I'm going to go back to my slides to make sure I don't miss any important points. But for most people, it's kind of looking at what's going on here. And then you got to pick your field that you're going to roll up to. I don't have a roll up for this one yet, so I might just put in this account number field so I can save it and come back and update that. So again, original wizard is really great, really powerful, but it's intimidating. You got to type it all in yourself. New wizard just walks you right through it. So really easy to do that. Put your relationship criteria in. This is another one you've seen in here. I've got where is closed equals false, just like a SOQL where clause, right? So you just do that SOQL query, and after the where, you put that in. Then, we can look through that and say, okay, what field, again, am I rolling up to? What calculation mode? I'm going to talk a little bit about calculation modes because it's really important and sometimes confusing. And so calculation modes you could pick. We've got real-time, we've got scheduled, we've got developer mode, and then we've got flow or process builder. It's still called process builder, which we want to switch to flow as things are transitioning, but that just shows we have the support for years to do process builder. And then there's what's called full recalculate or schedule full recalculate, which is actually outside of the schedule mode, right? Because that's you deciding you just want to run the whole thing. So real-time requires a DLRS trigger, and I'll show you how to deploy that. It's really easy. And then it will run in real time in the current transaction, which is important as people ask about platform limits and things timing out. You have to be very sensitive that you're going to be doing a lot of calculations here. And so you have to think about real time and if it's worth it. I like to default to scheduled. The new wizard does default to scheduled, so watch out, because if you use the new wizard and you use scheduled and you don't finish all the things you have to set up, it's going to run, but it's not actually going to update the parent records. So you have to make sure you've actually scheduled that Apex job. Otherwise, it's not going to do what you want it to do. But it's really nice because you won't run into platform limits that way. Developer mode, you're just telling the system, hey, I'm doing whatever I feel like with it. There's global methods. You can write your own code. You could have your own trigger. You could call DLRS the way you want, when you want in your transaction lifecycle, which is really important. You're doing lots of large rollups. It's really important to look into that. And then flow and process builder. This lets you invoke a specific rollup during a flow. So really nice. You can do an asynchronous record triggered flow. I'll show you that. And you can say, hey, after save, 30 seconds later, whatever, go ahead and roll this up, but I don't want to do it in my live transaction. And then whether it's active or not controls if in any of these methods, we're going to run it or not, or decide to not run it. Now, none of these settings impacts full calculate or schedule full recalculate. Those, like, you hit the button, it's going to roll the whole thing, and it's going to update every single record, including blanking out the value on that parent record, right? So if there's no cases and I rerun a full calculate on my case rollup, it's going to take all the accounts that have 0 cases and it's going to put 0 in there and blank that out. So just so you know, some people kind of have confusion around that, but it's going to make them all accurate, just like a normal rollup summary. All right, so then when I go to actually activate this, you're going to notice this, and I've already deployed some of this, and I'll show you how this works. But when you save it, you have to save it as not active if it's real time or scheduled, because it wants this trigger to be created. And it's going to throw a little error saying, hey, this trigger is not created. You can't check that box yet. So you just leave that box unchecked, and then you go on to a manage child trigger page, and it lets you deploy this trigger. Now, you're deploying a trigger, right? This is dangerous. A DLRS is generating code for you. It's generating test coverage for you. You don't have to write any code, but you should be highly aware of what we're doing here, which is we are generating code in your org. And so as soon as we start doing that, especially on an object like case, on any of the NPSP like grants and like all the AUM data, it's just really dangerous because there's tons of data there, and you need to stop and think about this, right? You need to do it in a sandbox. You test it, kind of make sure if you go use NPSP importer, right, or data loader, and you import thousands of records, what's going to happen, right? Is this going to work? Is it not going to work? It's not any worse than any other code. It's not saying that there's a problem with it, but as soon as you start deploying code, you just need to be comfortable with what that means. So when we do that, then hey, you deploy that and it runs. And so I'm going to switch back over and show you how this works, and show you some of these examples and just show how that rolls up that information. So if I come back here to this manage, and then, okay, it's going to say, hey, this already exists. So I've got a duplicate developer name for my rollup summary. There we go. So now you can see, I've accidentally saved that twice in here. But let's look at this open cases account rollup that I've got here. You'll notice too, after you create a rollup, you can't use the new wizard anymore on it. It goes back to the normal wizard, and now you just gotta make changes manually if you want to make changes manually. So you can see here that we've got open cases. We've got our parent is account, our child is case, the relationship ID is the account ID lookup field, and we're looking at is closed as false. And then we put that field in here as well, so DLRS knows to track this field for changes. We're just counting by ID. So we've got our ID and our count and our open cases field. I've set it to real time and system mode and active. System mode versus user mode. We really never see anybody set it to user mode. That's really going to be if you're in a really sensitive financial organization or something, and you need like user specific access to data, and you've got some compliance like SOX compliance or something else going on, and you're going to really limit these things down. Most of the time, you should just leave this as system, and you can set this to real time or scheduled. Karen, I saw you asking about saving it as inactive. Yeah, so this one's active because I already deployed the trigger. Let me show you a little bit about that. If I didn't have this child trigger deployed, it would throw that error, and you'd have to activate it and deploy this trigger. And so on this page, it has this remove and install. So I could remove it. It'll uninstall this trigger for me. or I can install it back. If we have time at the end, I can walk you through deploying a trigger if somebody wants to stay on, and we can deploy that together. Then if I go back here though, I can see that I've got all this set up, it's active and it's real time. So this means if I go to a case and I create a case, I delete a case, I close or open a case, that it's going to update this number in real time in my current transaction. So if I come back over here, I can see I've got one contact, I've got 3 cases. If I go over here, my details, you can see I've got different rollups. I've got open cases, closed cases, total, contacts without phone. As long as I'm live demo lucky here, I'll put a new one in and it'll work just fine. So now I got 4 cases. I come back over here, do a little refresh. It did it real time, but with Lightning caching, you might not see it right away. So there you go. Went from 2 to 3. Okay. So that one's happening in real time in this transaction, which means that that's your most kind of alarm bells where can my transaction volume handle it? Adding that automation on top, or do I want to defer it and schedule it? Then I've got another one that's scheduled, and we'll go back and look at these different ones. And so we've got closed cases here. And on this closed case one, this one's set to process builder and system. I'm actually doing this in a flow. And we can talk about that in a little bit here as well. And then I've also got some that are scheduled we'll talk about. So great, we're getting the data over. We've got about 10 minutes left. So we've got this record trigger flow, right? You can go that way as well. And you can say when a record is created, when a record's updated, a record is deleted. You can try the async path where we're saying actions and related records include run asynchronously, right? So this is all on a record trigger flow. The key thing to remember here is DLRS has to run when a record is created, when a record is updated, and when a record is deleted, right? Because if you delete a record and it doesn't run on deletion, your numbers are going to falsely stay high and they're not going to go back down. So flow is nice because you don't have to deploy that trigger, but flow is also a little dangerous because you've got to make sure you're running on all 3. And if you're not, you're not going to have the numbers that you want. So it's kind of which one are you more comfortable with? Which one would you rather maintain? The trigger is really easy to do, but we are working more and more towards making it easier to just use flow. So when you pick that, right, you'll have your record trigger flow, and you can pick your immediate path or your asynchronous path. And then you can pick your action and put in your new action, pick your parent record ID and your rollup summary. I think I got it open here. Yeah, so here's my flow. And so on this record trigger flow, you can see I'm doing it when a record is updated. So you have to cover created and deleted. If you do this one, you have to set some tight entry criteria, right? It's going to yell at you, the flow builder is. And then once you pick that run asynchronously, you just pick add an element. You're going to go down here to this action element, and there's already going to be a rollup, calculate a rollup action, right? And then you pick the parent record of the record that caused this to run. So you'd have to go look at the case's account ID, right? And you could put that in there. And then you'd have to pick your rollup summary unique name. This rollup summary unique name, you do have to just type it in. So you do have to go look for that unique name and type it in here. And you can see here on this closed cases Apex action that I've already got, I'm putting the case's parent account ID in, and I'm putting this unique name for this account closed cases. Just like anything else in Flow, you can monitor this in the Flow interviews, and you can debug it, and you can see what's going on, and you can make sure it's working the way that you want it to work. So you can go this path as well. But again, just make sure you don't forget to do insert, update, and delete. So scheduled mode, again, I really love scheduled mode. Scheduled mode is going to let you use a scheduled Apex job that's going to come along on a certain schedule and run all your rollups. So DLRS is going to store in the background a bunch of these scheduled item records for processing later. So it's a very common advanced kind of Apex queue pattern where every time something happens, you create a record in a queue called our scheduled item records. And then this scheduled job will come by every hour, every day, and run everything that's sitting in that object and run all those rollups for you. So that's really nice if you start getting into platform limits. We had a lot of questions about optimization and platform limits. We as a company use Dolores for just about every client. And our internal preference is start with scheduled, run that hourly, and then go from there. And if you need real time, you make a decision as to if you have to go to real time. In a small org, you can start with real time is fine, but scheduled is a really nice way to do it. To schedule Apex, you do have to schedule this roll-up job and pick what days and what time you want it to run on. The UI only lets you schedule an Apex job once a day at a specific time. So if you're like, well, Jim, I want to run this every hour, but then you have to schedule 24 of these. Yes and no, not really. If you are comfortable enough with the developer console, you can actually put this in anonymous Apex right here, and you can create a new scheduled job and use what's called a cron expression to say run it every hour. This is a little advanced, but it's not a lot, but it is a little advanced, and that way you could run this scheduled job every hour. We're looking at ways to make this super easy in the UI, so you don't have to do this, but today you have to do this, and you have to think about, how dangerous is that? And then you can see in this scheduled items record, you can actually see these items in the queue and monitor what's going on. There's also full calculate. This says, hey, every night at 2 a.m. every day, just recalculate all of it. A lot of people use full calculate, but it redoes every single record. So if you've got 1 million accounts, it's going to run on every single account, no matter what, even if nothing's changed. So it's very inefficient, but it's easy to do nightly to roll up financial information. There's also a list view where you can see all of the roll-up summaries that you've built, and you can see if they're scheduled and what type of calculation mode they're on. I also like to use the custom metadata view. So under the hood, this whole user interface is just creating custom metadata records for you, which is awesome because all you need to do to deploy this to a different org or to prod is to deploy these custom metadata records that you want and then redeploy those triggers that we generated for you. So as long as you do the trigger and the custom metadata records, you can get all that into prod, and that means you can maintain it, you can put it in a Git repository if you're doing source code tracking, and it makes it really easy to deploy and manage. So I like using this view because you can see as much as you want on a list view of how it's configured and what's going on. Roadmap. I want to get into this real quick. This is 2.17, so 2.7.1 is out from August. It's got the new wizard. Reed Stockton from NPSP also added some features to detect NPSP and TDTM when we generate our code to make it TDTM trigger compliant. We also added some global access modifiers for NPSP, so those might be some things you'd be interested in this group. And then for 2.18, when's the next one coming out? Now that we have all these volunteers, we're pretty committed to a 3 times a year Salesforce release of Dolores to, in the very least, try to test for any breakages from the Salesforce release upgrade and with DLRS and make sure it's not a breakage. It's only happened once that I know of when there were some API deprecations that happened and we had to make some quick updates. But other than that, our focus, we had a lot of surveys, is on scheduled mode, making it more efficient and easier to use, more flow invocables, make the new wizard better, improve the wiki and docs. If you haven't seen that, we have a brand new wiki and docs as of the last several months. And then continue to add things to the tools page and list views to warn you if things are configured wrong and they're not working, or if your volume's too large, and kind of give you a heads up on some of those things. So that's roadmap. I'm just trying to go through this real quick, and then I've got time for discussion, but I know we wanted to stop the presentation here soon. So if you want to learn more, join the conversation. There's docs here in this whole wiki. There's a Trailhead community for support and asking questions. And then there's the GitHub repo. If you really want to look at what's going on, or if you think there's a bug that you want to submit, you can look at that. So we've got our repo, which looks really, like any other GitHub repo. But then we've got the documentation. We had a question about recipes. There's this awesome cookbook that other volunteers in the team put together that show things. And there's some things about students and scores, outbound funds. So there's a lot of NPSP related things in the cookbook to check out. So questions that we had here is from the audience here is, what are considerations from upgrading from old versions of DLRS? unless you're on a really old version, it shouldn't matter. You should just be able to upgrade, and you shouldn't have any issues with that. We're pretty conservative about making any compatibility issues, but also most of what we're doing is just the user interface and the docs. The underlying engine is not changing much. So I don't have any fear of doing upgrades when I upgrade them for my clients. Examples of how DLRS is being used. The cookbook is awesome for that. Check it out. How can you use DLRS to design a system? I think this is more around if you don't need to use master detail anymore, and what's the implications of master detail. Say, well, I need master detail so I can do rollups. Well, now you don't, right? You can use Dolores to use lookups, or even a text field with an ID in it. Technically, it will work. It's a little harder to do, but you can do things like that. So it just gives you more flexibility on how you get that information, that aggregate information, up to parent records. We talked about this a little bit already. There's not really a whole lot that it can't do yet that it should. We're just focused on performance and ease of use so that everyone feels comfortable using it. We do testing. We now have a QE team. So we have a team that does testing of every new feature besides the developers. And then we're automatically creating betas with meta deploy and trying to test that as a volunteer team.